Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Happy February, you two. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy pre-Valentine's Day. Happy Black History Month. What else does February bring to us? I got the 1-2 with the whammy of my wife's birthday is 2 days before Valentine's Day. So every year it's like it's just, it's a great opportunity to show her how much we love her.
To show your affection. What a blessing to you. I will say in church world, February sort of feels like the beginning of the year because you do Christmas and then you get back and you're exhausted and then you got to get ready for the annual meeting, which most churches have their annual meeting in January, and that's another big stressor, and you're doing budgets and all that sort of stuff. And then you take a bit of a breather after that, and then February is like, okay, now maybe we can get going with ministry rather than all this fatigue and preparation. So do you feel that at all in your household, Sarah?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's like, it feels like it's weird, but it feels like things will slow down a little bit in Lent. Like it's like big, like we do that Blessings in a Backpack program we do that feeds all those kids.
Oh yeah.
We did like a bowling fundraiser for that, which is so much fun, and it was like a packed house, and they raised so much money. And then we hosted a thing at the house the next night for the vestry. And then we have a gala for the church and the school this Friday.
Wow.
It's just, and then diocesan council and then Ash Wednesday. I mean, it's just like
boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. But it's really, I think, it's really good stuff, but it's like that time of year where you're like, have to kind of have your game face on. And by that, I mean, like, not drink too much alcohol and get up in the morning and try to have a moment of quiet before your children bother you. So
yes,
that's what my game face looks like.
I got to say, following up on last time, I'm having a bit of a dry February and I'm enjoying it. I think I've dropped like 5 pounds already, but that's also because I don't eat. So,
Yeah. Your body's like, we're missing a major part of RJ's beer caloric intake. So.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
My cells are crying out.
Well, how are things going otherwise in the Heyman household besides a rapidly shrinking Reverend?
Good. I gotta say, ministry-wise, man, this has been an amazing week. We started 2 new women's ministries that were just like tons of people showed up, and our men's group was like 30 guys this morning, which is incredible. Awesome. And our regular women's Bible study is up to like 20, and I don't know, it's really encouraging and fun. And people are enjoying each other and learning stuff and sharing, and it's very encouraging.
This has been the latest installment of The Glory Story with RJ
the Glory
Heyman.
Story with
losing weight, crushing it at church.
It'll all end next week. It'll all end next week. Don't worry.
Somebody's going to fight you in this story.
Well, and I'm deeply anxious. Don't worry.
Are you RJ Heyman?
Don't you worry. Yeah.
Sarah, what's going on your front, on the home front? Anything exciting to report?
Oh, it's just been a sweet season of ministry, and these past couple weeks, Josh has been gone for. He went to check on our house in Mississippi, and then actually spent a lot of time with RJ and some other guys who are rectors in the Episcopal Church. So I took my kids to church with me for the first time with my college students, and that was so awesome.
How'd it go?
And funny. I mean, they were really good. It is like, I rarely have to face that thing that I think so many clergy women have to face, where you're literally like have your hands out behind the altar and you're saying the Eucharistic prayer, and you're also like sort of glaring at your 12-year-old out of the corner of your eye. I was like, oh, this is a new thing for us. But yeah, really well. I mean, my kids felt like such badasses because they were like around the college kids, and they, got to hear about college life at Rice, which is a little bit like Harry Potter. So it was, I don't know, it was really sweet. It was great.
That's great.
Yeah.
I feel like it's life in Charlottesville. It's not even a sadness, but we usually get snow here. And this year has been, I mean, it was like 65 degrees yesterday.
Yeah.
And
nice.
it's sort of this, it's like climate whiplash is what it really feels like right now, because it'll be 17 degrees one morning and then nothing. But I have such fond memories of sledding with my boys and sledding myself, and we haven't got to do that yet. So my hope, my prayer is that we do get a little bit of snow, not so much that it inconveniences us,
Right, exactly.
but that whole snow day thing I talk
Just
about
the
in
perfect
seculosity
amount.
is where everyone feels permission to take a deep breath. Is I miss it. I like it, and so
Yeah.
we'll see. Well, this first article was sent to us by Rutger Jan Heyman, and it's Sarah. It's thrusting us into the world of athletics, sports. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who you may know from such films as Airplane and
Lou Alcindor.
Lou Alcindor, yeah, the known most famously for holding the all-time scoring record for the NBA. Well, his record was broken this past week, I believe, by LeBron James. And so Abdul-Jabbar, who those who follow him know that he's become a writer and an activist, but really he's got a very active web presence and kind of he's almost a journalist, a pundit, what have you. Interesting man with quite a perspective. So he wrote, RJ, you sent this to us. I'll read a little bit of it, and then I want to hear from you what you thought about it, because this is kind of a major thing that's been coming in the world of professional sports. This is Kareem writing about what I think about LeBron breaking my NBA scoring record. He says this: LeBron James passed my scoring record and now is the leading scorer in NBA history. It takes unbelievable drive, dedication, and talent to survive in the NBA long enough to rack up that number of points when the average NBA career lasts only 4.5 years. It's not just about putting the ball through the hoop. It's about staying healthy and skilled enough to climb the steep mountain in ever-thinning oxygen over many years when most other players have tapped out. He says, I'm 75, though. The only time I ever think of the record is when someone brings it up. If I had a choice of having my scoring record remain intact for another 100 years or spend one afternoon with my grandchildren, I'd be on the floor in seconds, stacking Legos and eating Uncrustables. And yet, whenever a sports record is broken, including mine, it's a time for celebration. It means someone has pushed the boundaries of what we thought was possible to a whole new level. And when one person climbs higher than the last person, we all feel like we are capable of being more. That is the magic of sports. To see something seemingly impossible, reminding us that if one person can do it, then we all somehow share in that achievement. This is all about LeBron doing something no one else has done, about scoring more points than anyone has been able to in 75 years. There are no yeah buts, just praise where it is rightfully and righteously due. Bottom line about LeBron and me, LeBron makes me love the game again, and he makes me proud to be part of an ever-widening group of athletes who actively care about their community. Now, RJ, I mean, before we throw it to you, I just thought this was a remarkably gracious thing. You know, we're so surrounded by, you know, we've talked a lot about generational kind of conflict or tension before, and especially when it comes to really high-achieving people, kind of blessing those who come after them or getting out of the way. You just don't see it that often. And here you have him being so unconcerned with this sort of ego, what some would consider a blow to one's ego or one's identity, because it's not a small thing. This title he had. And yet I love it when he says that we all share in the achievement of one person. How can I not, as a Christian, sort of be like, oh, you don't say? That sounds pretty great. There's that vicarious, almost, imputation aspect to how he understands a record being broken more globally and then here personally. But why did you send this to us? What struck you about it?
I also thought it was just so humble and so starkly in contrast with how so many people, and maybe men particularly, but not just men, their relationship with their sort of legacy, especially if they've been very successful, they tend to really hold on to it. They tend to degrade people who come after them. You know, so much of the time athletes will say, well, if I'd played today, I would have had twice as many points or twice as many touchdowns. And they look down on the generation, you said, sort of this generational arrogance, and just the looseness with which he holds it. In contrast to some other, I will say this, in contrast to some other great athletes, who you feel like are still
Michael Jordan, is that what you're talking about?
Maybe Michael Jordan. Maybe Tom Brady. Maybe Tom Brady should not have come back for another year and had his marriage fall apart.
Right.
You know what I mean? Maybe Cristiano Ronaldo should not be playing for $100 million a year in Saudi Arabia. Maybe you, like John Elway did it well. To know when to call it quits and to be sort of gracious about it and to put your sense of self-worth in things that really matter, like your grandkids. I loved that. I also loved how he very gently and wonderfully rebutted Magic Johnson, because Magic Johnson tried to make a big thing of it. And he was like, look, I love Magic. We've been friends forever. But he got this wrong. Like, I don't care that much. And then he also talked about LeBron, who I guess somebody had asked LeBron about his relationship with Kareem. And LeBron was like, we don't have a relationship. We just don't. And Kareem said, you know what? That's true. And that's kind of on me a little bit. Like, I haven't reached out to him in the way that I should have, but I'll try to be more intentional about that because I think he's a great guy. And I really respect the man that he is and the teammate he is and the way that he's also stood up for things that are important. So it was just so suffused with wisdom and humility and grace, because we all want to scale those kinds of heights, right? To achieve those kinds of things. But so often people who do, it comes to define them in a way that's just so unhealthy. Like the guy who shows up to his 30th high school reunion wearing his Letterman jacket, even though he's 50 pounds overweight or something like that, or trying to relive past glories. But Kareem moved on. And I guess it also reminded me, I think Jacob Smith sent out a picture once of a tree in New York City that was surrounded by one of those little wrought iron fences, and there's a plaque on it that said, plant a tree and live forever. We're always finding a way to project ourselves into the future, except the tree was cut down. It was just a stump. That's
the irony of that picture. Huh?
That's the irony of that picture, right? Plant a tree and live forever, except the tree had been cut down. And we're always looking for ways to be important enough to live forever, when really I think the key to freedom and happiness is more von Zinzendorf. Do what you do it well, preach the gospel, then die and be forgotten, and that's okay. And I felt a little bit of that in Kareem's essay.
What do you think, Sarah?
That's all I have to say. Sarah, commentary on sports? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the relational aspect that is really interesting. Also, I'm here for an Uncrustable shout out, so thank you. Especially from an athlete. I'm like, yes, enjoy grandfatherhood with your processed peanut butter and jelly peanut butter and jelly. Those are delicious. Yeah, I mean, this is like very much a reality in my life. So I mean, I totally agree with him. I just feel like I've gotten the reality earlier. Like I was texting with a student of mine yesterday about some technology stuff I was trying to figure out. And I said to her, like, I know a lot of people are like, hey, like, I'm 40, but I'm like young for 40. And I was like, hey, I'm 40, but I'm like 80 for 40. So because we've been through so much, it's hard. It's like my whole vision on the world has shifted so dramatically away from worldly success.
Yeah.
Like so dramatically away from it that I can't even, it feels like another planet to me. And I understand that other people desire it, and I don't judge that genuinely. I'm actually like kind of marvel at it now because I'm like, oh, that's so great. Like you still have that in you. Like, I wish I had that, but it's gone. And I do feel 80, or at least like a 75-year-old basketball player. I don't know. I love how gracious he is in terms of passing the torch. I love that, like, I don't know what did Magic Johnson say? Like, I'm curious.
He just basically said Kareem's going to be kind of upset about this. This is going to really.
So interesting.
And Kareem says he knew how competitive I used to be, and that's a different person slightly. And
Kareem doesn't even say, he's like, maybe if I was still in my 40s and someone had broken my record just 5 years after I retired, I would have been tempted to suit back up and beat them or something. But he's now he's 75. It's too late.
Yeah.
So he's pretty honest.
I mean, you kind of wish that these guys had their own, like, RJ's church's men's group, right? That that they could really welcome Tom Brady into right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just be like, buddy, let's go sit in a monastery for 48 hours. Like, what's going on, man? Like, I think part of the reason we love this is it's just so refreshing.
Yeah.
Because, American athletes are like the closest things we have to like Roman god gladiator types. And so to have one of them not just be human, which is of course always a thing we talk about, but to be this humble and at the end of the day want the same things we want to be connected to family. Yeah, I mean, that is kind of unexpected.
Yeah, I also see it as a Sarah, you'd sent us something this week about sort of positive masculinity in sports, and it's like all these tennis players basically crying and like. But I actually do see this as something of two men, and the older one is blessing the younger one, and that is just that's a rare thing in any male culture, but so necessary. Like so many men, that means a lot to I just say it to me, to other people. I mean, I got to give my father some credit here, and because when he wrote this book about aging last year, and one of the things he says is like, what purposes do older men have, like that kind of is distinct, and he says one of them is to bless those who are coming after them, to specifically encourage. Now, whether that's on Instagram or elsewhere, but that's what you can do at that age that you can't really do at any other age.
Right.
And so, to be honest with you, I see it in the church. I see older leaderships. I mean, in our context, it's bishops who just never, ever want to let go and really bless the next generation. And I see it in rectors too.
Holding on to faded glory.
I see it that's when it gets to be quote unquote toxic leadership, where you're just consolidating power all the time, and you feel like it's your role to kind of keep to make sure they know who's boss. And it's such a more powerful testimony, and I think a much more graceful one to do what Kareem does here. And I don't think that was part of his mind in going about this. He sounds like a pretty just kind of a, I don't know, for lack of a better word, sort of enlightened man who's had a lot of time to reflect on things. And
it's so interesting because I'm reading a book right now, and I just finished it this morning. But in the book, there was this moment where the father is dying, and all the son wants is a blessing from him. Mm-hmm. And they had a very fractured relationship, and the father gives it, and the son receives it. But then the father says, well, you know how hard that was for me to do.
Right.
And I think one thing that's so beautiful about this is it seems very effortless. Like even in that, the dialogue about the grandkids, it's like, it's effortless. Well, I can tell you right now what I'd do. I'd be on the floor with Legos, this is a part of who he is.
Well, I hope to remember this when I get older. I'm sure it's harder. It's harder than you think when it actually comes down to it. But I just want to. It's incredible to see, and it's heartening to me as a man who, because and also I'd say within Mockingbird, or maybe just on our podcast, we tend to poo-poo accomplishments a little bit, or that is somehow works, and yes, they can be so enshrined in so much the person's identity, and yet here, this is, I think, a proper, beautiful picture of this kind of worldly accomplishment. We all share in it, and it's imputed to the rest of us, and I'm just excited. It makes me love the game again. And that what is it? God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. Like that's on display here. RJ, you were going to say one more thing?
That it also calls out, and he's had a lot of time to think about this because he retired 30 years ago or something. But I've talked to a few different people recently who either recently or a few years ago retired themselves, and it was really hard. They just lost all sense of themselves. They got depressed. They felt aimless. Sometimes people who are tired become alcoholics, because they have nothing better to do, or they have health. So that's also really a thing. It is hard to give yourself sort of completely to something in that kind of way, and then just sort of stop doing it.
Yeah.
And I've seen that over and over again. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I think, a big part of it is like have hobbies. Hobbies are important. Cultivate hobbies so when you retire, you have something to do.
Well, let's talk about a polar opposite view of accomplishment and in this insane article, but also extremely well-written article from The Cut. It was written by Caitlin Moscatello called The Fleischman Effect. Now, Fleischman is in Trouble was a book written by Taffy Brodesser-Akner, and it was also developed into a TV series that went on Hulu starring Jesse Eisenberg and Lizzie Kaplan and Claire Danes. And I guess the show has had a big wake among a certain type of lady in Manhattan. Now, this is what she writes. And this article, by the way, was all over the place. So clearly the article named something, I think, that is out there, even for people who do not live in a brownstone in the Upper West Side. She says, many of the certain set of New York women read the book years ago and watched the show only to find themselves turned upside down, just like the opening sequence of the show. For them, watching Rachel, a high-earning talent agent desperate to be accepted by her Manhattan's private school set, watching her mentally break under the pressures of her career, marriage, motherhood, and childhood trauma, and Libby, a magazine writer who hasn't written in 2 years and moved to suburban New Jersey with her family, long for the possibilities of her youth and search for the pieces of herself she can still recognize, has set off an internal alarm that sounds a lot like the voiceover in the show. Is all this really worth it? Am I spending these years, maybe the best years, focused on the right things? When does it get easier? Now, Caitlin Moscatello, she talks to a bunch of women who fit this demographic. And one of them says, the Rachel character gave us permission to feel bad for ourselves for a minute. I think that women like me are thoughtful and mindful enough to know that life is not so bad. We don't ever want to complain, but Rachel just let us feel sad that we feel like we're going to lose it a lot of the time. And this woman made clear multiple times that she doesn't expect sympathy from other people. Since the show, one woman found herself making dinner plans with friends from other parts of her life and is re-examining her own relationship to work. Watching Rachel invest so much of herself in her career, seemingly at any cost, this woman says, I did find that to be legitimately ugly, even if I've been guilty of it. In a certain sense, all of us who are in that high-pressure city environment, and it is absolutely an environment of nothing is ever good enough, work becomes so important. I felt so defined by achievement and feeling what is the next rung on this ladder? Watching that dramatized, you're like, this is disgusting. You have more than enough. Then for others, watching Libby languish in suburbia was more difficult. What do you do when the thing you thought you always wanted isn't a possibility anymore? One woman said. She recently found herself thinking about that question in Target, which was even more depressing. You know how Karl Lagerfeld was like, you're in sweatpants, that means you failed? Well, that's kind of how I feel about Target. Whew. Speaks to another woman who says this, my dream life would be to live in Brooklyn and send my daughters to St. Anne's, but the reality of my life is I live in the suburbs and haven't taken a day off in 2 years. I get up at 6 a.m., I work until my daughter wakes up, then I do breakfast and get her ready, then the nanny comes, I work all day, I relieve the nanny, then get back on my computer and work until midnight after my daughter goes to sleep, and I do that every day, and it's still not enough. She understood Rachel's relentless pursuit of earning more, make more money, be more successful. I see myself in that 100%. Watching Fleischman myself, Moscatello concludes, I couldn't help but think of how the show aired at a moment of peak exhaustion for women, even privileged women who have it so much better than most. The story takes place in 2016, but it finds us roughly 7 years later, battered from parenting and working a pandemic. Rachel and Libby are the manifestation of different struggles women face and impossible expectations, but a core similarity is that they are effing tired. A lot for a TV show to bring up, but it's clearly struck a chord. It's amazing to me how it's kind of like a demographic of women that's both villainized and doesn't feel like they have any right to their own suffering. And yet they all have this collective sense of feeling trapped and on a treadmill to nowhere. and there's like this show has sort of unleashed like a primal scream among that kind of privileged set of women. And I think it's beyond that, by the way. I've had conversations with you, Sarah, and with our friend Jane Anderson Grizzle, just the palpable unhappiness I sense among a lot of women in their 40s that we with that Ada Calhoun book, Why We Can't Sleep, is all about it. But the amount of sort of divorces initiated by women in that context, and just there's something is awry, and I feel like this puts a finger on part of it. But here I am speaking for a different set of people. What do you think, Sarah?
I mean, it's funny. The thing that stuck out at me was this bit about how condescending the world can be to stay-at-home moms, where they say they have the hardest job in the world, but in actuality, the hardest job in the world is being a mother with a job. And I mean, I that definitely resonates. I think for a lot of women I know, and I think, I think this is multi-layered. I certainly think the pandemic has not helped the situation. And it's really hard to see up close. Yeah. It's hard to see friends get divorced. I know we've all had that experience. It's hard to see the effect it has on children. But honestly, when I read this, it does sound truly miserable. I mean, that kind of workload sounds truly miserable. And I don't understand it. And I guess I'm just naive, and maybe I grew up with more resources. And so these are people who like really wanted more resources in their life. I don't know. But it just is heartbreaking to me to read. And also, like, I want to say, like, we're not immune from this in the church world. I mean, and I don't know which side of this puts me on, but I remember when I had my daughter, like, there was a senior clergy woman to me who had a certain amount of power in my life. And she said, basically, when are you going to get a real job where you work on Sunday mornings? And I was like, well, I mean, that's kind of hard to do because I've got, this baby and I've got a toddler. And she was like, well, when is Josh going to step in and be responsible on Sunday mornings? And I was like, well, I mean, what does that mean? Like, just this real push. It just, I'm always hesitant in these conversations because the last thing I want to do, and I think most women want to advocate for, is some sort of a like 1950s model that frankly we always harken back to, but didn't really exist for most women, right? Like both my grandmothers worked. So, I mean, but there were less demands on everyone. I say that carefully, obviously, considering race, that is a pretty bold statement, but this was that was a simpler in some ways time. Right. And so now we're facing this just like consumption on consumption on consumption, and someone has to fund it. And then you just begin to wonder if, I don't know, y'all, if we're all just sitting in a room with a bunch of shit we bought, but no time to open the boxes. I don't know. It's just so bleak. And I read this, and honestly, the only answer to me is like, y'all need to go to church. Y'all need to get around some people that aren't your peers. You need to have some deeper conversations. You need to get off Instagram therapy. Like, it's so bleak to me. And of course, I guess I'm kind of talking my way through this, but of course, like, divorce makes sense maybe in those situations because it seems like at least it's going to change one thing. At least, I mean, you can't get rid of the kids. You had them. You can't end the career. How are you going to buy the stuff that's advertised to you on Instagram? You can get a divorce. Yeah. I don't know.
RJ, what do you, you've got some, dare I say, a little experience here. Not as a woman.
Not as a woman.
As far as I know.
I guess, first of all, I'll say that I have a little bit of what's described here inside of me. Right? It's never enough. It is never enough. Go, 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 go. Not in the same pace is enough. It has to accelerate. Things have to get better, but almost in a way that accelerates. And you have to do everything perfectly and as well as you possibly can, and being exhausted all the time. And I have some of that inside of me. Absolutely. And it also reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine in Texas, in Houston, who's very successful. He was an energy trader and did very well. But his pattern of life was interesting. Like he'd worked for Enron for a while, and didn't go to jail or anything. He actually said Enron was like the best place he ever worked. It was very meritocratic, and a lot of people who worked for Enron said that. Did very well. When that kind of blew up, he had the resources to kind of like take a year off, basically, and not work. And he took his kids to Africa for like a few months, and he trained for triathlons and whatever. And then he got back into the working world. And again, it was like go, 80 hours a week, training, going. And then he sort of retired. And I remember talking to him once about how it seemed to be all or nothing. Like either you're working 80-hour weeks or you're not. And he sort of said, yeah. He said, in my world, there really is no in between. You're either all in or you're all out. And it can't be one or the other.
Yeah.
And that seems true about like the kind of life that's being described here in New York, where like, private school tuition for a kid is like $50,000 a year.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
right.
And housing costs are millions of dollars a year. And And this sounds, very bougie to say, but like New York is a hard place to be in the summer with kids. And so if you can afford to get out and be somewhere that's a little bit cooler and maybe near a body of water and put kids in camp, like you do that. But it's just, there's no way, unless you're independently wealthy or a trust fund kid or something, that you can sort of afford to have a life that's not go all the time. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe there is a way to do it. Maybe that's a lie. But when you're surrounded by people, everyone you're working with is all in, and college is $70,000 a year. How much is rice?
Oh my gosh, it's $50 a year. Yeah,
that's it.
I think
I'm surprised. That's cheap. That's cheap. I mean, as someone who's about to pay for 2 kids to go to college, next year, it doesn't feel like there's an alternative. You're either all in or you're all out, and it's tough to find a sustainable existence.
It takes a lot of energy to see through this all the time. I mean, it's like there's one woman in there who says, I thought maybe I should. Maybe I could get to the point where I'm not looking up people's house value on Zillow the second I'm invited to a dinner party at their house. And I was like, whoa, maybe I should start doing that. But I mean, I know that if you're in that hive mind kind of thing, it takes a lot of energy to continually tell yourself, it doesn't matter. It's like, we're all going to die. Everything's like, this is all, I want to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It's easier for him to say. He scored a gazillion points, and there's all sorts of reasons not to do it. I just want to say sympathy, because I will say, yes, this applies to New York, but we get into all these hyper-contextual debates sometimes. I mean, everywhere I go, people seem to be feeling like they need more than they currently have. I mean, I don't know anyone who, like, what do they say? You rise to your level of, like, expenses. So it's like everyone I know needs about, like, just a little bit more money to be comfortable. And that applies to the people who are making 7 figures and the people who are making 5. Like, it's all... there seems to be something about the human condition that where we want more than we have. And I read someone say, greed is a sin in every language or something like that. And Lord save us from this. And when there all this talk about enough and nothing's ever enough and these priorities, I mean, I do feel like I have in my head the interlocutor that says, Mockingbird, sometimes we preach this law and gospel stuff is directed at very neurotic type A achiever types, who are on the coast, and it's very specific to, yes, that works if you're in that situation. But I partly I read this and I think, well, this seems to have resonated far beyond the boroughs of Manhattan and the people in the top income brackets. And I do think there's somewhat, even if it does only, if it is a sort of a emphasis of the gospel that speaks specifically to such people. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, like, don't they need these people? This demographic that I read in here, and I would often find myself like on the outskirts of it all the time. They're dying for a word of grace. Like who doesn't want that? I mean, and yet RJ, I mean, we've been in a situation where we've tried to really bring that to bear in populations that look similar to this, and there's a deep resistance to it.
Well, yeah, because you're like pulling their whole life apart, Dave.
Well, and I'll say, I'm not experiencing that now. I experienced it with 20-somethings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, like people on the other side of their life, they're like, yes.
Totally.
But people who are still in the achievement mode. And I will say also, there is something addictive and infectious about the kind of energy that you have in Manhattan. Like it's crazy. Like I miss that. It's like one of my friends said who lived there for a while. He's like, in New York, you can walk out your door and anything could happen. You could end up anywhere. Anything could happen. And if you've, so I don't know.
Well, we have we have achievement as joy, and we have achievement here as absolute bondage. You know.
Yes. Law.
Yeah. I also just have to say, like, where are the men?
Yeah.
Like, where are the men? Like, this whole article is about these women leading these,
They're working 100 hours for Goldman.
miserable lives. Yeah, but, like, where are the marriage conversations where you're both sitting at the table and you're like, this is not the life I wanted? Or why is this the life I want? Like, I think this article, more than anything, speaks to the lack of vulnerability in marriages where people aren't having real conversations about, like, looking around and saying, like, is this what we wanted?
Yeah.
Are we happy? Do we feel connected?
Yeah, but Sarah, I remember a conversation with a buddy of mine who was a doctor in New York, and he wasn't a therapist, but he functionally was, because all of his patients would tell him everything.
Yeah.
And he was like, RJ, it's easier to find a new wife than a new career.
That's so sad.
It's so sad. And
Like,
he knew it was sad.
Yeah.
But that was the mentality of a lot of these very successful guys. Like, I'm not going to let my wife get in the way of my earning potential. You know, it's crazy.
Well, they need help.
Yes.
It's just like, this is like.
Well, that's not just
you know,
men in Manhattan. I would just put it out there.
No, it's
No,
not.
that's right.
No,
That's-
I mean,
that's
I
right.
just, it's like, to me, it speaks to like the siloed off nature that like of marriage, modern marriage. I don't know. It's just super bleak.
Yeah, and I see it from I see it the other way around in spades. You know. Well, it's easier to find a new husband than to find a new career.
Yes. Yes.
Well, let's go from those understandings of achievement to a slightly more, I think, a theological one, which Wesley Hill wrote about on Covenant, called "Secular Neglect, Salvation Anyway." He's talking about the book of Esther. He says in a short, provocative book, Esther and Her Elusive God, John Anthony Dunn points out that Esther, it's the New Old Testament book, the book's
Not Esther Perel.
Not Esther Perel. That Esther, the book's protagonist, and Mordecai, her cousin, aren't really depicted as conscientious observers of the Torah. Many readers have noticed their lack of prayer to God, or any mention of God in the book at all, for that matter. The complete absence of any longing for home, for Zion and a rebuilt temple, and freedom from Gentile domination. And at an absolutely crucial juncture, when they're facing the imminent prospect of genocide, the neglect of the Passover. Dunn concludes, we have no reason to assume Esther or Mordecai have much faith at all. The people of God portrayed in Esther appear to have experienced a decline in faith and religious adherence to the God of their ancestors. If Dunn is right about all this, Hill writes, then it may be that we need to rethink the implicit theology many of us think we've discovered in Esther. It could be that what we have in Esther isn't just a theology of divine providence and protection, but also something like a doctrine of the, quote, justification of the ungodly, Romans 4:5. God's commitment to stand by God's people when they're at their covenant-keeping worst and see them through anyway. In this way, there may be more theology, not less, in what Dunn calls this most secular of biblical books. Because God not only intervenes, God intervenes precisely at the point when no human virtue or piety would compel him to do so, where the only hope is the sheer divine intention to bless, save, and protect, regardless of whether it's acknowledged by the saved ones at all. I like it.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I love this because one thing that it's so interesting to do spiritual work with young people, and that you realize how much it's been drilled into them that church is like law, and that you know, along with following all the rules, you have to follow the rule of feelings, right? So you have to feel a certain way about God And if you don't feel that way about God, then you shouldn't go to church, and God doesn't care about you. And so it's a constant kind of conversation of like, yeah, it doesn't actually matter how you feel about God. Like God still pursues you and loves you, just over and over again. And so you can show up here just because there's free food, like literally can be the only reason you show up, and God still loves you, and that, and we're happy you're here, and God's happy you're here. So I love this. This is like a great way to preach this text, that God shows up no matter what, it's just like the Samson and Delilah thing that I love so much that, Neil called out to me, but just this idea that, it's not like anybody was like really following the rules in that context. And God, so often we love that phrase, a fall from grace, which is not in scripture.
No, fall into grace, right?
We love the phrase fall from grace, but really, like, when we see people falling from grace, God sees someone who needs to be rescued. And that's all scripture is, over and over again.
Yeah.
But I love him saying that there. That's cool.
He says, he quotes some preacher who calls Esther the most Christological book in the Old Testament.
Awesome.
That's so cool.
Yeah. RJ, what do you have to say? Anything?
No, that's just, I agree with everything Sarah said. Like, we've been going through Matthew and a few of our Bible studies at church, and the genealogy is like the most boring thing in the world, and yet it's not if you look at the characters in the genealogy, because there's so much bad behavior.
Yeah.
There's prostitution and incest and trickery and murder and adultery, but it's so cool. The people I've talked to, they get it. I'm like, what does this mean? And they're like, it means that God works through sinners. It means that his purposes move forward in spite of our mistakes. It means that Jesus is for everybody. Gentile, Jew, sinner, and only sin. There's no righteous people.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love that. That's the story of the Bible.
There's a wonderful talk that was given at our Orlando conference by a guy named Pastor Al Hill, who went through the genealogies just to basically make it clear that it's all grace. I mean, that it's kind of from the top down. He just went through the genealogies and been like, this person's illegitimate, and this person was that, and here you go. Like, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, it's quite kind of like just jaw dropping.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
The other thing I have to say about Esther that I think is very important, and I'm 100%, I've told this story before on this podcast before, but one of my very dear childhood friends, a girl named Monique, who grew up deeply Pentecostal, would watch the 700 Club every morning, and she had a cat she had named Esther after the biblical character, and she would hold Esther up, and they would say the sinner's prayer for salvation together. So I think of it every time I hear Esther the cat getting saved every morning on the 700 Club.
Cats need it.
That's incredible. I love it.
Mississippi's a beautiful place to grow up.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, this is one of the things here that I find so comforting about this just Hill's description of Esther, is that people are not sort of being dealt with according to their faithfulness or their piety, or certainly their accomplishment. And yet, there was another article that appeared this week that found us tied together by our lack thereof. In my talks about the low anthropology book, one of the ways in is to talk about imposter syndrome. This sense there's this art. I reference this cartoon of people on a crowded street and everyone going in different directions. They're all thinking the same thing, and what they're thinking is that everyone else has it together. I still have no idea what's going on. And that we are sort of united in our confusion. And instead of that being a place of judgment, that in fact makes everyone feels better when they hear about that. That's sort of a way into understanding why low anthropology is counterintuitive good news. Anyways, I've been using this phrase, imposter syndrome, and everyone's talking about it. And Drew Barrymore was talking about it the other day on her talk show, which is, people keep sending me clips of. Clearly, she's really talking about real things on that.
She's been through a few things.
Yeah,
she's had some moments.
My God.
Yeah, I mean, you read about her background. She never had a chance.
No.
So anyway, Leslie Jameson, who spoke at a Mockingbird conference a long time ago, wrote something in the New Yorker about the history of imposter syndrome and how we're all talking about it now. The title of the article is "Why Everyone Feels Like They're Faking It." And she begins by talking about Pauline Clance, who coined the term imposter phenomenon. She did it with her friend Suzanne Imes. And the pair had spent 5 years talking to more than 150 successful women, and they recorded their findings in a paper, The Imposter Phenomenon in High-Achieving Women, Dynamics and Therapeutic Intervention. And she describes both of these women who wrote this had, growing up, they'd always thought that they'd failed every test they took, and if they always got A's, that sort of thing. They always felt like they didn't belong. And so they're basically talking about an experience of intellectual phoniness or living in perpetual fear that some significant person will discover that they are indeed intellectual imposters as being particularly widespread among high-achieving or professional, at that point, it was, I think, 1985 when this was published, women. So we're back to talking about ladies, but it's much more, as I've gone around the country talking about this, I see the men hold up their hands. She says almost 50 years after its formulation, the concept of imposter syndrome, and it was originally called phenomenon, not syndrome, has achieved a level of cultural saturation that Clance and Imes never imagined. Maya Angelou once said, "I've written 11 books, but each time I think, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody, and they're going to find me out." Neil Gaiman, the comic book and novelist, in a commencement address that went viral, described his fear of being busted by the, quote, fraud police, whom he imagined showing up at his door with a clipboard to tell him he had no right to live the life he was living. Clance and Imes describe the cycle that imposter feelings often produce: a sense of impending failure that inspires frenzied hard work and short-lived gratification when failure is staved off, quickly followed by the return of the old conviction that failure is imminent. Repeated successes usually don't break the cycle. All the frenzied efforts and mental calculations that are directed into preventing the discovery of one's inadequacy and fraudulence ultimately just reinforce the belief in this inadequate, fraudulent version of the self. The experience is more specific than mere self-doubt, Jameson writes. It's a fear of being found out, revealed for what I really was. And it was an anxiety that I felt complicit in, having produced these false fronts with my lies. But she talks about there's a generational and, in fact, a racial component to it. And she says, when I asked my mother, who's 78, if the concept resonated, she said it didn't. She'd struggled more with proving herself than with feeling like a fraud. She told me she suspected that most women in her generation, and especially in her mother's, were more likely to feel the opposite, that they were being underestimated. And yet, Clance and Imes still thought they wanted to describe it as an experience rather than a pathology. Their aim was always to normalize this experience rather than make it into a syndrome. Jameson concludes by saying, if we reclaim the imposter phenomenon from the false category of syndrome, then we can allow it to do the work it does best, not as a vague synonym for insecurity, but as a way to describe the more specific delusion of being a fraud who has successfully deceived some external audience. Understood like this, it becomes an experience not diluted, but defined by its ubiquity. It names the gap that persists between the internal experiences of selfhood, multiple, contradictory, incoherent, and the imperative to present a more coherent, composed, continuous self to the world. The phenomenon names an unspoken, ongoing crisis arising from the gaps between these various versions of ourselves, and designates not a syndrome, but an inescapable part of being alive.
I'm curious, what are spaces where you all feel this?
Every Sunday morning.
Every single Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Where it's like, well, today's the day when I either say something that makes no sense, or I go too far, or people discover that I actually have nothing to say, or that I have nothing new to say. That they'll be like, RJ, you've told that same story 40 times. Yeah. Although I was joking with my men's group this morning, I was like, I love you guys because you never remember anything I say, so I can just keep on saying the same thing over and over and over again.
Well, I feel it anytime I'm interviewed about my book or any books. I feel it anytime I'm called to look at as any kind of spiritual authority in anything. And I feel it when I'm asked to talk about being a parent or something like that. I mean, they talk about it as being so specific to women, and I don't want to deny that. But I want to say that I feel it all the time, and I most of the guys I know, if they're being at all honest, they feel it too. Yeah. She does mention that it can have it's especially pronounced on people who've crossed certain thresholds, and that's why maybe a certain generation of women felt it very acutely. But if you've switched kind of from working class to professional class, or you're the first person to go to college in your family, something like that, it can be more pronounced. But I was honestly preparing for this episode. I was talking with Sam Bush, who's next door, who writes for Mockingbird and is ordained minister. And he was prepping for his sermon, and he said, "Yeah, Dave, this is the week that they all find out that I'm totally a joke." And I was like, "Well, we already know that, Sam." But
exactly last week,
because you said it in your sermon last time. But at the same time, it's like I feel that way every Sunday.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know, Sarah. What do you think about imposter syndrome, or let's call it phenomenon,
I was
condition?
Sort of thinking about, I was thinking about when is it that I feel this, like what is that? And I was thinking about church, but for me, like I think because I've kind of created what I do, I really love it, and I get nervous, but I don't feel like an imposter. But like the second someone other than my husband is like, "Hey, would you come like lead worship at my Episcopal church on Sunday morning?" I'm like, no, I mean, like that is terrifying to me, because I mean, I'm just worried I'm going to basically use the salad fork on the entree. I mean, so to speak, and just like the altar is terrifying. All of that can be really terrifying to me. So I was thinking, I mean, I think that definitely shows up. But the other space it shows up in, and I hope I'm not alone in this, but, in mom culture, I feel this a lot. Like, sometimes I just get really bored with, like, what we're talking about. And I'm like, am I not a good mom because this isn't interesting to me? Or, I feel like I'm not participating enough in the stuff my kid's doing, and then everyone will find out that I like low-key like hate trying to decide what color a t-shirt should be for homecoming, like it's such a weird internal dialogue, but it's so present. I do like this idea of it being like a phenomenon and less of a syndrome, because God knows we need less syndromes to be diagnosed with, or certainly self-diagnosed with,
pathologized.
But I just wondered like what that feels like for y'all.
I think it's, I can't help but when she keeps talking about the gap between what we present to the world / what we feel the world reflects back to us or demands from us versus who we actually are. I mean, that is, for me, when I'm preaching, that's a very potent gap in terms of talking about grace and talking about forgiveness and talking about sort of imputed righteousness and justification, all these historical terms. I find that to be, and if it's completely contextual, and some people genuinely don't feel this way ever, I'm that's news to me, because it's never. I mean, and she would say that she interviewed some women of color who grew up in the same way her mother did. Is like, I'm used to being at the table and everyone underestimating me rather than people thinking I know more than I do. Right. What I would say is what she talks about as being useful in it being that kind of point of connection. Like, it probably has gone overboard. I mean, Sarah, remember when you used to talk about the blessed messes of motherhood and all these ladies trying to talk about how terrible of a mother they were, and like that being a different type of posture and creating, but it's sort of like we're going through life just constantly with the antenna of like should and justification and like condemnation of the law, just pinging at everything where we are. We walk into someone's house. Is this a nicer house than mine? Is this a better? Is this we go around someone's family, or they're a much better parent than I am. Like their kids are so happy. We go to a church. The same thing's happening.
Sure.
And I think it's happening for these ladies in Manhattan.
And I think that's completely, I mean, in terms of anthropology, I think that's completely inescapable. Like, I think that's just part of like the biofeedback of our brains and our bodies. But I think we can't control our first thought, but we can like reflect on our second thought. And I think, the second thought is like always interesting. Like, can we kind of take a deep breath and be like, I'm just glad to be in their house. You know what I mean? Like, I'm glad their house is not in Turkey and Syria. Like, I don't know, like whatever. It's just, I don't know.
I was actually thinking about, the Oscars is coming up and we've been watching some of the nominated movies. And so have you guys seen Everything, Everywhere, All at Once?
No.
Have you seen that yet?
No.
I'm told I've got to see.
It's supposed to be so fabulous.
It's insanely good.
Yeah,
and
okay.
there's this incredible metaphor for human existence, which is this giant swirling everything bagel of death, which is just incredible. But a really powerful moment in the movie is when one of the characters just sort of says, look, we're all confused. We're all scared. None of us have any idea what's going on ever. And it's that way all the time.
Yeah.
And the only thing we can possibly do is show a little bit of kind of kindness to each other. And it's sort of about the triumph of kindness and love over kind of a nihilistic approach to life. And then it's a really good movie. And the other image that came to mind is we also watched The Fabelmans, guessing the name.
I've been told the one I need to watch is To Leslie. I've heard that is the most beautiful picture of grace.
You and 4 other people.
Well, I don't care if there's some
it
plot.
looks amazing.
It's supposed to
Jamie
be
and I
about
want to watch it, but
love
Marshall
for
was
the
in the
love
room.
list. Anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Marshall was in the room. We're like, we don't think this is a 6-year-old movie.
Yeah,
so
it doesn't look like it is.
When we put him to bed, if we can stay awake, we'll watch that movie. But in The Fabelmans, the Steven Spielberg character, and I assume this is true, who's a total outcast sort of at his school, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism, but he makes the movie for the senior day at his high school. And there's this one incredibly handsome athletic jock that sort of ends up being the star of the movie, and Spielberg makes him sort of look like a god, basically. And the jock afterwards confronts him and he says, "Why did you do that? Like, I can never live up to the image that you put on that screen. I will never live this down. I can never be the person." And he's really angry and hurt because even he recognizes that he's been that he can't live up to those standards, And to go back to the beginning, I think that's why, it's so beautiful that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar let go of being the biggest point scorer in NBA history, because that's an impossible thing to live up to.
A little bit.
Oh,
what a relief.
Yeah. It's like he wasn't even holding it. It's like it was like somewhere in the back of his like basement. Do you know what I mean? In a box. And he was like they showed up and they're like, "Hey, like there's a new guy in town." He's like, "Oh, I think that box is in the back. I'll open up the garage." Like it was just like not.
But thank God.
Yeah.
Thank God. Like, will Tom Brady, how will he feel when he's no longer considered the greatest of all time? Will that hurt him, or will that be a burden he can put down? Just like, oh, thank God. I know it will, but he needs to get over it, man, and get a life.
Well, talk to Michael Phelps. It creates
he's been
lots of internal strife, shall we say.
Yeah.
Talk about that's right, imposter syndrome. He had to go engage in some bad behavior to kind of clear his palate and show people that he wasn't America's golden boy, because that's too much to carry, man.
Well, let's get back. Let's finish on a note of sort of grace for those who do not live up to either the standard of behavior set by their parents or as a parent themselves. Since this speaks to us, there was a very powerful personal essay put up on Mockingbird last week by Cole Huffman called XL Grace. And it begins like this. He says, "My oldest son, 26, is caught in drug and alcohol addiction, spanning 7 years now. In the deep furrows of my heart, seedbed hopes for my children were planted before their births. It feels as though the locusts swarmed this son's row. On the inside of his left arm, he has a tattoo in bold black ink, XL, not for extra large, but the Roman numeral 40, specifically Psalm 40. A once aspiring musician, he liked how U2 put Psalm 40 to music on their War album, and that his dad, a Bono admirer, made that his go-to prayer for him. A friend once gave me an apt child-rearing analogy. He said, parenting is like driving a vehicle. During the growing up years, the parents are in the front seats. We move to the back seats when the child is old enough to navigate life on his own. But if he goes off-road at full speed, bouncing his parents around violently, something will have to change. I didn't leap for my son's life as he sped toward cliff after cliff, wheels on fire. We have a good relationship, all things considered, but it's hard to relate to someone with an appetite for his own destruction. There's a lot I don't understand about addiction, whether it's more disease, disorder, volition, or victimization. I'll leave it for the experts to debate. I do think about it in Psalm 40 terms. He quotes the psalm, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure." A pit was something an enemy threw you into. A bog is something you fall into yourself. That's addiction. Pit and bog, both. Addiction has imprisoned my son. Addiction could drown him. If addiction has made my son self-destructive, it's made me self-doubtful. At first, it was the self-doubt of wondering what I did or didn't do that sent him to the demons. I had to get out from under that burden of false blame. Though it sounds odd to put it like this, I occupy a more positive self-doubt now. Freed from giving easy answers, from doling out fixes or formulas to those living in the same kind of protracted distress. They once asked the 19th century evangelist D.L. Moody if he was filled with the Spirit. "Yes," he said, "but I leak. My hope in relation to my son leaks. At times I need others to hope for me, sort of like when marathoners hit the wall and go jelly-legged and need holding up. Keeping hope doesn't mean expecting our situation will have a happy ending. It means bearing in mind that God is resolved in his Son to take thought for me, as Psalm 40 puts it in conclusion. That has to be enough. As Anne Lamott writes of it in her book, Help, Thanks, Wow, if I were to begin practicing the presence of God for the first time today, it would help to begin by admitting the three most terrible truths of our existence. That we are so ruined and so loved and in charge of so little. So ruined, so loved, in charge of so little. That's not just my son, a wilderness unto himself. It's me too. How long to sing this song?"
I just thought this was like one of the best things we've had on the website ever.
So powerful.
It feels like a piece you can go back to again and again. A piece about parenting, a piece about failure, and a piece about addiction. And it's interesting we're talking about it today because I was listening to the radio this morning and there was a gentleman being interviewed about the fentanyl crisis in New Hampshire, and he lost his daughter in 2016 to it. And, he was talking about just how relentless it was, how like back in 2016, you couldn't get health insurance to cover rehab. And then she sort of, foisted herself into the Marines, and that was great for her. She had a whole new group of friends. But then she tested positive for marijuana, which he's like, of course, is legal everywhere now, but tested positive for marijuana and then was ousted from the military and then was dead in months. And the thing that was so powerful to me about that was he said to other parents who are struggling with this, he said, you really need to reach out to your friends. He said so often when we're going through this as parents, with adult children struggling with addiction, we become more and more like private. And I mean, I think imposter syndrome, imposter, whatever we're going to call it, is interesting in that there is some truth to it, right? And I wonder about like how much we all kind of have this like imposter thing with our pain and our suffering, like, and how rare it is for us to actually share it while we're in it. Like this is not a victory story.
No, there's no,
this is not, and it's not even a tragedy yet. Like he's writing in the middle of the war to us. It's a letter from the war. And it's so powerful and so filled with graciousness. And, if you're a preacher, I cannot commend this to you enough, because it feels to me like the Stephen Ting thing we have on the website from like 4 million years ago. About what the gospel is. Like, it feels like that thing I would go back to just when I was trying to write a sermon about anything. Like, it's just so heartfelt. So thank you to Cole for writing this.
Yeah, what a thing. I wonder if his sons read it.
Yeah, I wanted the same thing, Yeah.
Yeah. But I also recognize he needed to write it, and what a I will say again, when you risk that, and here he is risking something that is, because I mean, a lot of parents are like, well, do you want to know the exact path of addiction the kid took so that you can theoretically prevent it with your own child, as though it's all basically their fault.
Totally.
And I
how did they die? It's our favorite question when people die. How did they die? With the subtext being, we don't want to die like that.
I know. I heard myself doing that this morning. A friend of mine said his wife was raising some money through the Super Bowl for her sister that passed, and I was like, this second I was like, I don't want to know like how's she doing, or I don't want to know about what's the fundraiser. I want to like, wait, how did she die? It's like, how
did she die? Because I need to avoid it.
Yeah, okay, I'm okay. It's But I thought to myself, the lightning rod of connection and hope, in fact, that this piece has had, and that you sometimes see the web, can do beautiful things like this, or just writing in general, but through the risking of that story in the context of some reflection, and he's not just confessing, he's couching it in some ways that I think are actually helpful that I can learn from. But I also just felt an increase of love and compassion as I was reading it, and not in self-righteousness in any regard.
Right.
I don't know, RJ, what do you...
Also, that and Lamont prayer.
I mean, good Lord, RJ. We are so loved and so ruined and in charge of so little.
It's just... we need to send that to all those ladies in New York. You know what I mean?
I mean, it's kind of the inverse of what they're living through.
It is.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right. Crushing it.
Right.
Unloved.
Right.
And in charge of everything.
Yes!
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh so hard, but that's it.
It's true.
Yeah. It made me think of all the wonderful widows in my church.
Oh.
Like all the women who've lost their husbands and really could well up at any moment thinking about it, whether it happened last month or 10 years ago. And yet, like, they're just the most lovely. I love them. And they're carrying that every day of their lives. So it's like there's not a day that goes by that they don't think about their husband who's passed and how much they loved him. As one of my old bosses in ministry, Dr. John Westfall, who I love dearly, wrote a book called Getting Past What You'll Never Get Over. And that's just true. You'll just, you may sort of get through it, you may get past it, but you're never going to get over it. It felt like it's written from a similar kind of place.
And the not only that, the Psalms are clearly written from that kind of place, right?
Yeah.
And that's not just Esther in there. That's Holy Scripture. It kind of boggles the mind a little. It's not just. I always thought, by the way, that it was Bono had written those words, because like it was. I first encountered Psalm 40 through war, not through the Bible.
Yeah. I mean, I love this idea that this kid has this tattoo. Like, how beautiful that in the wreckage of his body that is filled with drugs and hopelessness, that he has marked it in this way. Like, what a blessing that, like, that's on his body. And I hope that we can all, I mean, I just today heard a story of a priest who said something disparaging about people with tattoos. And I hope that we can remember, especially when we see young people with tattoos, that there's something about that for them that is an incredible identifier, and we don't know the story behind it, and we don't know the meaning behind it, and I just think this is the most beautiful thing, and like a reassuring thing for the father that, like, no matter what this young man puts his body through, like, it's been marked with a prayer.
I think about that thing in baptism with the oil. You marked as Christ's own.
Oh, you are sealed by the Holy Spirit in baptism and marked as Christ's own forever.
Yes, that. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, marked as Christ's own. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. XL. Thank you, guys. We'll talk to you in a couple weeks. Hope your February continues as swimmingly.
Happy Valentine's Day. Have a good one.
You too, guys.
Y'all.
Bye.
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 Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord. Praise